of like the story of like all of the sort of no code type. I don't even know what to call them sometimes. Like, some people will call them like apps, because you
Yeah.
kind of have some, features of that, or I called them like workflows for a long time, or processes, or there are just so
Yeah.
many things that kind of fall under many umbrellas. The cool thing about um, you know being able to use no code for stuff is, I was saying earlier, like I didn't have coding or programming experience as a kid, um, which is still the case today, because like this gap has been bridged by tools like Zapier, where you don't need to know how to do stuff really technically in order to be able to automate things or have different systems talk to each other, which is just like increasingly necessary, and especially I think in the nonprofit world. Organization is going to have like its own unique constellation, like almost like a DNA of like their tech
Mm.
stack that is specific to them. I bet if you compared any two nonprofits, you would find that
The
they're, yeah.
yeah, the technical landscape is always different. Always,
Yeah.
always.
Another thing I think about with, no code and workflows and all the things we're talking about is like the earlier you can put something in place, like the greater dividends it's going to pay. And you can always go back and improve pieces of it and like take lessons learned and then upgrade it in the future.
So, Matt, thank you so much for joining us today on Igniting Change. Did you want to introduce yourself? Tell us who you are, what your role is, and what organisation you're with today.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm thrilled to be here. So I'm Matt Holbrook. I currently work at an organization called Global Growers Network, and I'm the director of operations there. So I'm responsible for everything from the finance and the HR, some of the fundraising, and maybe particularly relevant for our conversation, the IT of the organization. And I've only been here for about 4 months at this point, so it's a very new role for me. But Global Growers is an organization. We work with immigrants and refugees who have moved to the Atlanta area where we're based, and come from agricultural backgrounds. They want to grow food for themselves, for their families, their neighbors, and in this new city, their new home, don't have access to land to do that. And so what we do is we operate a network of community gardens for folks to be able to grow food. And we work with currently about 160 families who have plots in these gardens. They're growing food that is typically not available in grocery stores in the U.S. And for a lot of folks, that's kind of the service we provide. And we also go a little bit beyond that for people who are interested in growing food, not just for themselves and their families, but want to begin a small business, find some sort of sustenance that is not just like food, but also financial. And we provide spaces that are larger for people who are growing for farmers markets and other market opportunities. So we have a 1.5 acre market garden, we call it, where there are a few growers who are growing for there's a community sort of farmers market associated with our train system here in MARTA, and then we're just bringing online a new farm that the organization acquired during the midst of COVID, actually, and it's a 23-acre organic property that is currently being prepared for growers to come onto, and we have our first cohort of 5 families that is starting next week, which is kind of crazy to think about. So they're breaking ground on their to start with 1/8 of an acre plots at this farm to start learning about how to do organic farming, which is kind of from a growing perspective, not so different, from what people would be doing where they come from, right? Like you're not using like the chemical fertilizers and things like that, but from a sort of paperwork standpoint and like the organic certification standpoint, there's actually a lot on that side of things that goes into being able to call your food organic, right? So you have to track, logs of your inputs into the fields, what you have sprayed or actually not sprayed, what your yield is, your harvest, what you're planting, all those types of things. And so this group is going to be training on how to do that kind of piece of it and bringing their expertise in actually growing food, which they have deep experience with. So we're super excited to get them in there and kind of beginning that journey. So it's a very, very cool organization, and I'm still kind of a newbie here and learning about all this stuff, but.
So you say you've been there 4 months. Where were you before, and how did you find out about Global Growers?
Mm-hmm. Well, I was working at another nonprofit here in Atlanta called Georgia Innocence Project, which is a legal services organization that works with folks who have been wrongfully convicted. And I worked there for about 6.5 years. So started in 2016, actually Halloween of 2016, which was portended only good things. So at GIP, I had a very similar role as I do now at Global Growers. And after being there for 6.5 years and working, from an organization that was, 2.5 people when I started, to when I left, we had 15 people on staff. Really kind of, there was a lot of infrastructure that was involved in that scaling up. And after being there for so long, was kind of interested in looking for some new opportunities, new places that kind of needed some similar types of skills. And the very non-exciting way that I found out about Global Growers was through a job posting that I saw. Went and learned about the organization and realized they were doing very, very cool stuff. And ended up applying. And now I'm still connected with GIP, Georgia Innocence Project. I joined the board after I left, and still very committed to seeing that work continue and go well. And of course, in the tech world, there are always the, hey, this isn't working questions that never cease. Even when you're not there, the things don't always cooperate as they should. And there's a great staff in place that handles most of that stuff now. But occasionally there are the things where you set something up 3-4 years ago, and somebody coming behind is like, what is this? Why did they do it this way, and why is it not working now? So.
But it's amazing that you now sit on the board of directors, that you can help them and you can just make sure that any of those questions get answered correctly, I might add.
Hopefully.
But it might be worth me just kind of sharing with the listeners today how we actually met. So we were at a conference. Mm-hmm. Matt, you were actually speaking. So you were on a panel talking about no-code solutions.
Yeah.
And I kind of want to dig into this in a little bit more detail, because actually it's a space that I don't hear much being said about, but it's certainly from my opinion, it feels like it's growing. There's a lot more people in this space now, certainly at not-for-profits, that are having to find their own solutions because of budgets or resource or capacity or whatever. People need to find smarter, more efficient ways to work. And quite often that can start internally in operations, working out how things can be made more efficient, and they can work better together. Now, I know you were talking about some of the no-code solutions that you had put into place, and actually, you're a very technical person. Like, where do you acquire these technical skills with such a broad hat? I say broad hat. You're wearing multiple different hats within these smaller organisations. And I think that is increasingly the case, is definitely what we're seeing across quite a lot of not-for-profits out there globally. But talk to me, how did you acquire these technical skills to be able to do this stuff?
I think some of it's necessity, right? Because especially as you're saying, in a small organization where you're doing a lot of different things, technology can kind of be like a force multiplier for whatever it is that you're doing. If it's used correctly, it can also kind of sometimes do the opposite of
Yeah.
that, depending on how you implement it. But I grew up and had, sort of a somewhat maybe more technical background. My dad was a system engineer, and so we had like the internet back in like the early 90s before at least like people in my world were getting their AOL discs and things like that. And I remember as a kid, like being so into the idea of computers without knowing anything about them or how they worked that like I dug out, I think it was an old Apple II that was just sitting in our basement. And, of course, like in the 90s would have been like completely useless. But, I thought it was just like cool because that was what my dad did. And, kids, I think, are naturally drawn to the things that their parents are doing. And so they had this thing in, big carrying case in the basement, and I like unpacked it and set it up, and I don't even know what you could do at that point, with one of those computers. It was like maybe like a word processor or something like that. And I think that I had it like set up in my room or something, and my parents were like, "What are you doing?" And I had like made myself like a fake office desk or something, right? Which is like so funny because now that's like anathema almost in a way to be you get tied down to your desk and it becomes not like an exciting thing. But I had done that, and they were like, I think at some point they were kind of like, okay, well, we'll get you like a real computer that you can use. And um and I was never, into like the coding side of things. Like I didn't, by the time that I was kind of getting into technology, kid of the 90s, like you didn't have to know that to be able to work with computers. Um, and so, the stuff that was like, interesting to me was being able to like, oh, I can like learn how to take this apart, and like replace parts in it. And, my sound card isn't working because, this is like back in the days where, you'd had like a computer and a monitor and it's all separate, and you really could open it up and play around with it. And so I got very into that in, kind of my early teen years in a way that, in hindsight, maybe explains some social challenges that I had at that point. But yeah, so I kind of had that background with it, but, um, that kind of gave me like a level of comfort thinking like, oh, well, I think of myself as a techie person, even if in reality I'm not the same as like the coders of the world, the programmers, the people who actually can do these really amazing, like almost magical things with technology. So I was like kind of like the, like a power user type, right? Like not the expert, but like kind of the person who has the same sorts of tools and technologies as a lot of other people, but just like figures out like the most kind of extreme way of using them. And when I started my first job, it was actually not in the nonprofit world. It was at a contracting company, and um, doing HVAC stuff. And so, apologies, I'm getting my I we have an
No
alarm
worries.
system.
Don't worry,
Uh,
that can be edited out.
yeah, it's
So
all
we
good.
just, it's
or
all
or a
good.
great example of technology doing something unexpected. Um, but in my first job, I was working at this contracting company. It was very small, and that was kind of the first place where it was like the rubber meets the road of like how do you use technology in a workplace. Um, and at that point it was like we have a list of clients in a spreadsheet, and like none of the names are done in the same way in the addresses, or sometimes they're capitalized, or sometimes it's like you're saying spelling out street, and other times it's an abbreviation. And so at the very beginning of this job I had no idea what I was doing, and things that I encountered like that, I would just be kind of like trying to brute force whatever the solution was. And that was really just like, oh, we have like names that aren't standardized, like I'll just go through and fix the names, which is kind of crazy to think about. But I was just a kid at that point, so I didn't know any better. Um, and also, problems like, hey, we don't have a real like customer and sort of like ticketing system for the customers, which at least was a place where there was like a sort of out of the box solution that we were able to find for that. And that was like the place where I kind of think about having done sort of the first um, thing that like I would come back to later and sort of like kind of open the door of like, how do you approach business problems in a way that you can solve with technology? And the thing was recording phone calls, not actually like the audio of phone calls, but the fact that they had happened, which is not a super challenging problem. But if you can imagine like a HVAC company here in Georgia where it gets quite hot in the summer, and um, this place had hundreds of customers, and they would all call when the air conditioner wasn't working, uh, and so that's actually can be kind of like a health problem, and sort of have some urgency around it. And we didn't have a lot of texts and people, so we had to be able to track those phone calls, and the solution, which at the time, again, not very advanced in hindsight, but it was just like, let's have a spreadsheet where every single call we're tracking the same things for each person. What time do they call, what is their address, like, are they a current customer, that type of stuff, so that we just have a log that we can refer back to. And so when I started at Georgia Innocence Project, I was at the HVAC place for maybe a year and a half. They had that problem too of like, who calls us and why, and like, how do we know? And they were doing that on scraps of paper. Like, I don't know if you've ever used these like carbon copy little
Yes,
things where it's
yes,
like,
yeah.
this person called, like, what is their message? And so when I started there, there were just all these like little slips of paper on people's desks, and I remember one day somebody couldn't find one of the slips of paper, and I say somebody, like, it when I started at Georgia Innocence Project, there was an executive director, my boss, and there was a part-time bookkeeper, and I was the sort of second full-time employee at that point in that iteration of the organization. Um, so it's probably my boss was trying to find, some one of these little messages that somebody had taken down for her, and couldn't find it. And I was like, wait a second, this is my first week or two on the job. Like, I know how to do this, and and because you know I had already gone through and done this sort of very, very basic spreadsheet log before. I was like, how can we do this a little bit better? Because there were some challenges in doing the spreadsheet log, like particularly like if you just have a running spreadsheet that a couple people are editing in Google Sheets or something, like information might get entered in the wrong row, or you might not actually get a field filled out that you need. So was thinking about, just how to do that a bit better, and particularly in an organization that, the stakes and sort of subject matter was a lot more serious. Working with folks who are imprisoned, incarcerated, oftentimes, they're not even the people calling us; it's their family members who are desperate for information, and so understanding, why somebody was calling us and being able to respond to them, having the information from their last call was really important. And so what we ended up doing was a Google form, because that makes more sense than a spreadsheet, because it goes to the same place ultimately, and you can require people to fill out the fields, and you can have sections, and you can kind of have some logic to a form that goes a little bit beyond what you would just be able to do in a spreadsheet. So, that was kind of the first automated system that I built, because, in doing this, I sort of stumbled upon no-code tools as a way to kind of actually do a little bit more with that, right? So we had this call log form that people would fill out. We had interns and volunteers, and they would, be able to answer phone calls and record the information in a standardized way, and then we use no code to take those responses and do different things with them depending on the type of call or who they're calling for. And so we used this tool Zapier, which is, one of the biggest no-code platforms out there, to basically take each response and evaluate it, as it was going into the spreadsheet. And so if it was marked for follow-up, for a particular staff member, that staff member would get an email with the details of the call. So it was no longer just like, hey, there's a phone call, like check the call log for it, or somebody needs to go and knock on your door after you're out of the meeting and say, you got a phone call them back. It started doing these alerts for folks that let them see who was calling, what it was for, respond on their own time, not be interrupted by something that was potentially unimportant, and also have like a log that they could refer back to at any point that was not like an undifferentiated, hey, here's every call we've ever gotten, but just like, here are the email alerts of all the calls that are specific to me. And that, was, again, like not a super complicated thing in hindsight. At the time, it felt like, I don't know, I was like building a new internet or something. I don't, like, it was super cool, right? But yeah, it ended up being something that as far as I know, they're still using it. Unless something has changed in the past couple of months, but
which goes to show it's the biggest compliment. Often the most simple solutions are the best solutions, and if it's still being used today, it's obviously credit to you for going through that. But it's very interesting, like when you're in the weeds of it and you're trying to implement a solution, it's often not as simple as it kind of starts out to be. Then you basically start coming across like edge user cases and like, what if this happens, or you start coming across, or I guess you uncover lots of other instances where you need to kind of put some thought and consideration into.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, that is kind of like the story of like all of the sort of no code type. I don't even know what to call them sometimes. Like, some people will call them like apps, because you kind of have some, features of that, or, I called them like workflows for a long time, or processes, or, there are just so many things that kind of fall under many umbrellas. So that was kind of my introduction to no code, was like creating this call log system that had that little bit of logic of, the sending the alerts to the right people, and making sure that follow up was happening, and those types of things. And then later we ended up, kind of integrating it with other things as well, which is kind of the cool thing about, being able to use no code for stuff. Is, I was saying earlier, like I didn't have coding or programming experience as a kid. Which is still the case today, because like this gap has been bridged by tools like Zapier, where you don't need to know how to do stuff really technically in order to be able to automate things or have different systems talk to each other, which is just like increasingly necessary, and especially I think in the nonprofit world. Like we just have all of these tools.
It's so true. It is so true. And I think as time moves on, there seems to be more and more third-party tools that people are leaning on, and they're all varied and different, and trying to get them to talk to each other is it's becoming increasingly complex. And quite often it can be very overwhelming, especially for smaller organizations that just they become tired and frustrated and confused by how they get things to talk to each other. And I think quite often the perception is, we need to get a third party to come in and kind of do this for us. Right. But actually, you're a wonderful example of, look, you've managed to do a lot of this stuff yourself, and you've been learning as you're going along. Are there any particular sources or places you go to for help?
Just Google it is kind of great. Always helpful. With Zapier, they have great documentation and customer support. So like when I was, kind of building this call log tool, and then later some other cool workflows, could always just go and ask, whatever the specific problem was, and usually get an answer there. And then, people just like post things on, if it's GitHub or, Stack Overflow, and not that I'm like overly familiar with these spaces, but just like that's the result that comes up sometimes when you're trying to figure something out. And so, you sort of learn, and now actually these days, like ChatGPT is really useful for trying to
Yeah.
figure out some of these technical questions and get to answers. Just recently, uh, I was working on a spreadsheet, which I don't love to do many things in spreadsheets because I think people can like overuse them for things
Yeah.
that are like not really what they're supposed to be. So there ends up being a lot of like databases, quote unquote, that people are doing in spreadsheets and sort of like like project management and things that like you can kind of do it, but you end up having to really work to make that useful. And then there are like tools that are much better for most things. But this spreadsheet was related to grant tracking because at Global Growers we have a lot of restricted grants. A lot of our funding is coming from government and private foundations, and of course in the grant world, um, everybody wants to know what their money is being spent on. They want you to be able to report back and say, hey, like, you paid for 7% of this person's salary and, this specific piece of equipment and, 20% of our office rent or whatever. And so that was a big challenge and still is for us at Global Growers coming in because we're piecing together all of these different funding sources. Ultimately, the work does not map on so neatly at times to the grants, right? It's like we know what the work is. It's actually, conceptually pretty simple, right? We're like connecting people with land and providing them resources and training to be able to grow food and connect to markets. But when you're trying to map that onto your funding sources and particularly the kind of like money and deliverables, that adds a whole layer of complexity, which is another conversation perhaps. But in this case, I was working on kind of a monster spreadsheet that was for something I think spreadsheets are good for, which is like financial stuff, right? Like calculating things and I wanted to be able to do this in a way that like allowed us to see, how much we're spending in a particular grant, both in terms of like overall spending, but also like people's salary and like how can we like forecast that out in a way if we were like, hey, what if we put 5% more of somebody's salary, over the course of 6 months or something to this grant, like how much then are we spending down there and what does that impact our other grants? Or what impact does that have on other grants? And I started, working with some formulas to like kind of be able to calculate these things and quickly, because of the kind of complexity that's there, I was like running into like I'm spending so much time in like these reference documents for like Google Sheets, like trying to understand, formulas that are based on, like conditional logic and have dates embedded in them and things like that. And I was like, why don't I just ask ChatGPT? Like, I'll just go and I'll describe my spreadsheet and like, here's what I'm trying to do. Like, give me a formula, and it usually has a go, and it's like gives you something that like doesn't work the first time, and then over time you realize if you just ask it to like check its work after every response, that it'll find the problems before you can actually try it, and then you do that a few times, and you can plug it in, and it just
And
works.
did it work?
Yeah, it did. Yeah, I did that for a lot of different pieces of this spreadsheet. Just like, hey, here's what I'm trying to do. And then if it didn't work or I was getting an error, I could just go back and say, like, here's the error I'm getting. And it even went so far as to, like, you know, suggest creating a couple little app scripts to do pieces that, like, would have been much more difficult and complex with formulas. And it was like, here's how you create the app script for this, and like here's the the little snippet of code that you want to plug in here, and like it literally gives you the step-by-step directions for how to do that and turn it on. And if there's something where it's like you need to update this, it'll leave you a little comment in the code. And so this is, it's interesting because the progression of like doing no code stuff and not having to understand any of that to now we're like you still don't have to understand it, but like you actually can kind of see what underlies whatever particular function or solution you're trying to put together is really interesting, and being able to manipulate that and do things again without a lot of training or knowledge, just kind of what I've picked up in working is
It's
so cool.
it's also very impressive, and I really do hope those listening, this inspires you to just experiment and try
Yeah.
things. Obviously, not all on maybe real data, or just
Right.
have like a little baby experiment where you can just have a
Yes.
play about with things. But I think quite often, especially with no code solutions, there are, and do you know what? I haven't heard of anyone actually using chat GPT for help in terms of no code
Oh,
solutions. So that's
interesting.
really interesting
Yeah.
to hear. And I would imagine there's actually quite a lot of people doing that globally. So tell me, Matt, obviously that initial kind of solution that you put together for Georgia Innocence Project, and obviously you put something, so the HVAC, and then it went to Georgia Innocence Project. Is that one of the solutions, one of the, I guess, tech for good solutions that you're most proud of that you've done yourself, or is there another one that you're like, oh my gosh, like,
Well, I think that was like the one that opened the door for me to do like other cool things because, still at the end of the day, like a call log is not like the sexiest solution
yeah,
ever. And but it was really learning kind of like that toolkit of like how can you take these things that are out there and basically mold them together for whatever use case you have. And as we were talking about, whatever systems you're working with, because, probably like every organization is going to have like its own unique constellation, like almost like a DNA of like, their tech stack that is, specific to them. I bet if you compared, any two nonprofits, you would find that
the
they're, yeah,
yeah, the technical landscape is always different,
yeah,
always.
even if,
Don't
yeah,
get you do get similarities, but they
hmm
are always very unique.
yeah, like we all might be using like Google Workspace or Microsoft or something like that, but then when you get into those kind of, particularly within industries, the specific tools that are
Yeah.
developed, it can fracture pretty quickly. And so, with the call log, eventually we ended up integrating it with some of those systems. Like we had a case management system, and we could send a log of a call if it was related to a client to the client file, um, and some other cool things like that. And so in figuring out how to manipulate those different systems and tie them together, there was another kind of more interesting subject matter problem that we had at Georgia Innocence Project, which was the one that actually I talked about at NTEN, the Nonprofit Technology Conference, which was open records tracking. So it requires like a little bit of explanation of the work that we did at Georgia Innocence Project. So just stop me if I'm going too far down the rabbit hole here. But when you're working on a case of wrongful conviction, um, you know, sort of where these cases are at procedurally is people have gone to trial at that point, or they've taken a plea agreement, so they are convicted of the thing that they were tried for. So in the eyes of the legal system, they are guilty. There's no longer like innocent until proven guilty. It's like you're proven guilty and you're in prison. So everything is like worked out well. And there is an appeals process that takes place directly after you're convicted. But once that's over, and that's often just kind of a sort of matter of course, you don't have any right at that point to an appeal. So where Georgia Innocence Project was taking on cases was after, excuse me, after the trial or plea agreement, after the direct appeal, which took place immediately after the trial, and people you know were innocent or are innocent still and don't have any recourse. There's no right to counsel past that stage. You can have discretionary appeals, which is where you're going to a particular court and saying, please take another look at this. There was some procedural error, there was some constitutional error in my case, but courts don't have to consider those. There's no requirement that new evidence be heard or anything like that. There are mechanisms that allow you to do that. It's just that, it's all discretionary and sort of in the hands of the court at that point. So for Georgia Innocence Project, taking on a case really meant, reconstructing it and understanding it, because a case of wrongful conviction happens when many different things have gone wrong and compounded each other and created a, picture that's presented at trial that is not reality. And once that becomes a guilty verdict, untangling that is super difficult because so much error has happened, bad information has been presented as fact, and you can't really reverse those cases without actually understanding what really did happen. So GIP would get a case, and the job would really be to like reinvestigate it, figure out where did the errors occur, and then if we thought there was a case of wrongful conviction that there was an innocent person in prison, would be going and trying to get that case back into court. So a huge part of that sort of initial stage, though, of reconstructing the case is getting the original documents from the case. So like the police investigative reports, trial transcripts, lab reports, interviews, just everything that you can like kind of imagine from like your CSIs or Law and Orders or whatever that they're doing, and then that all goes in files somewhere, and it is often never seen again. But in Georgia, we have open records laws, and they're actually pretty good. And so you can go to a public agency and make an open records request, and if it's a public document made by a public agency at some point in the past, unless there are very, very strong reasons of like confidentiality or sensitivity, they're required by law to produce those documents. So you can imagine that like any given case is going to have hundreds, if not thousands, of pages spread out across different agencies, the police department, the crime lab, the prosecutor's office, the medical examiner. All of these places have their own records and own record-keeping systems. So for one case, you might go to 6 or 7 places just to get all of the paperwork that made up the case at the time. And often these are like old cases, so the files are paper. They're being stored somewhere, maybe in somebody's office, maybe in like a warehouse. But it's a challenge to pull all of that together. And so that's in one case that's kind of like a complicated thing. But then when you have dozens of cases where you're trying to do that, and they're at various stages, and you're pulling different types of documents at different points, that becomes like really, really complicated to track. Like, what actually do we need in all the cases, and where are all of our requests, and how do we know when they've been fulfilled, or when we need to follow up and like go and bug somebody. And when I started at GIP, that was paper-based. So, kind of crazy to think about.
Whoa, my gosh.
Yeah, so in 2016, there are like these logs in these paper files for every client and or person that whose case we were looking at. And so if you were like, what open records requests do we have out to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, for example, you really couldn't answer that question, right? I mean, in theory, maybe you open all of the case files and could like compile your own new list for that point in time. But it was not really feasible to be able to do that. And so it wasn't until I had been there for a couple of years and really got enmeshed in the work and understood the subject matter, and we had started hiring people, and all of the kind of scaling up that happens when you're doing that we decided to tackle this problem more comprehensively, and of course turning to those tools that we were talking about with the call log of forms and spreadsheets, and integrating things together in a way that let us track the records across every case and all the cases in aggregate. And so being able to look and say, hey, here's everything we have out to a particular agency or in a particular case. And so it was the same sort of tool set of a Google form that people would fill out when they had one of these requests that they wanted to make. And that went into a spreadsheet. And then I would do this all differently today, of course, like as I'm describing it.
Yeah,
Uh,
but that's fine. That's
yeah,
fine. But you've
of
got to
course, of
start
course.
somewhere.
Yeah, exactly. So, and then, with no code tools, we kind of like didn't really touch on this, but, a lot of how this works is you are putting together something that is like an automated action based on some trigger or event. So with these, examples I'm talking about, the trigger would be a new row in a spreadsheet. And then with that, happening, this, no code workflow or process or automation triggers, and then you're kind of putting together little blocks of like, what do you want to do with that information? So it's like when there's a new spreadsheet row, like you could say, go and look up and see if that exists in another spreadsheet. And if it doesn't, then go into the case management system and get the client's, official, unique ID, and go back into a different spreadsheet and put that in, and create that, a row for this actual records request, and so on and so forth, to where you can actually build something that starts with something really simple, like a request for an open record, or a public record, and then kind of manipulates and organizes that information in a way that ends up being very different from the input. You can also generate documents and things based on that. So, we had it set up so that it would generate a letter based on the case information. So you would be like, hey, look up this case that somebody wants to request a document on, get some basic case information, fill it into a template, and then send that off to the agency, based on the contact information that was put into the form or what we have on file for them. And so it really streamlined kind of that process, not only from the perspective of being able to like send these things out more automatically instead of having like an attorney or an intern create each request sort of specifically for every case, or request, but also the tracking of it was probably the more important piece, because all of this fed into sort of a central tracking spreadsheet that was separate from the place where the form responses were being collected. And that's where we had kind of the ongoing tracking going on, a place where people could go in and take notes or change a status, say, hey, this hasn't been responded to, or this can be closed out, and we can change the status and it will no longer show up on the spreadsheet. And so then we have this view that is basically the 100 requests that we have open at the time. And then also we have the view that is that, several hundred requests that have already been completed in the past. And when, you want to see what have we requested in this case, just being able to go to one place and see all of that at once made it way easier to understand kind of, what information we had at our fingertips and what we still needed to get, and who we needed to go and bug for that information. And so that was, probably, the solution that, I, again, still think they're using it today after whatever it is, 4 or 5 years. And really it was on a subject matter level kind of a big upgrade from what they were doing before.
It's a huge upgrade.
Yeah.
And absolutely, like they went from a paper-based system to a digital system. And I know you caveated early because you were like, oh, I'd probably do it different today.
Yeah.
Fine. And you know what? It does make me smile, because I think probably most designers and developers out there, everyone is very self-conscious of their work. They recognize that you can always improve it. But the fact that they are still using it today is testament to the fact that this actually solves quite a big problem for them. Going from that paper-based to the digital system is a big switch to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And then it also introduces new problems, right? Like what happens when, right, like, something breaks in the middle of, you're right, because these things can get kind of complicated, especially when you're touching a lot of systems. And so, when you're working with no-code tools, you realize that, it can be kind of like a Rube Goldberg, like all these different things are connected, and then when one of them stops working, then it kind of all grinds to a halt. And so, it's still better than doing something on paper, but that kind of leads you into like another order of kind of thinking and problem solving, which is, kind of more where I find myself today when I'm looking at something to, create or some workflow that we're trying to put in place for something, which is like not, what is the way that kind of replicates sort of what we're doing here, be it paper or some other form that does all of the exact same things in the way that we're doing them, but like instead, how can we do this like very simply in like a really durable way that, reduces complexity while at the same time putting something in place that is like functionally a lot better than what we're doing. So when I approach a problem today, and I actually had one recently at the new job, which was just like kind of a little, fun one because it was, I had kind of done something similar at GIP, and so I knew what I wanted to do with it, and that was a hiring process because we're in the midst of hiring a few folks, and this is one that I think probably like every organization hopefully has to do at some point, and so. Previously it was all email based. I send your resume, your cover letter to this email. The operations coordinator would take that and put it into a spreadsheet manually and, respond manually. Hey, here's the, interview schedule that we have, pick a time. And so that's fine if you have like one job open and you have somebody whose time can be committed to that. But it gets to be more onerous the more positions that you're posting. And also another thing I think about with, no code and workflows and all the things we're talking about is like the earlier you can put something in place, like the greater dividends it's going to pay. And you can always go back and improve pieces of it and like take lessons learned and then upgrade it in the future. But if you get something that is, better than what's happening now, and especially if you can reduce somebody's manual time, then that just will compound. And so the hiring stuff, I was like, this is the first kind of round of hiring we've done when I'm here. Let's just do this from the outset because we're going to use it every single time that we have somebody to hire. And with this, I actually kind of went to a tool that I discovered way later at my time at GIP, which I'm kind of embarrassed about because it's now something that I see as like fundamental in a lot of ways, which is Airtable. And going from doing things in spreadsheets, particularly data tracking, to doing it in Airtable, it's like I don't know what the like the Cambrian explosion.
It's a mic drop moment, isn't it? It's
really
like,
is.
This is a really good, useful tool.
Yeah, and it does like things that you can kind of do them in a spreadsheet, right? You can now, especially in like Google Sheets, they're doing like drop downs and like chips and things like that, again, still so much more functional in Airtable. And then the linking of like records and things like that, it just is like, it is a different dimension of like kind of working with data than doing it in a spreadsheet, which I think is where a lot of folks start, and certainly where I was for many years. But with Airtable, they also have like a little bit of automation that's like they're starting to do in the platform. And so we set up this hiring system that basically was, using an Airtable form. It had records linked to the form, so when somebody wants to apply for a job, it's all sort of one start point for every position. You're selecting the job from the form, and then you're customizing the questions based on the job, and then all of that feeds into an Airtable base where you have your candidates for every position, and then of course in Airtable you can group those together or filter them down just however you want, so that you have this view of all your candidates coming in, and then you layer the automation on top of that. So it's like, okay, somebody fills out this form and it goes into Airtable, and then let's have a field here that is for their interview status. Like if we want to interview someone or if we want to decline someone, I think it's really important to communicate to folks regardless